Thanks for coming this morning. My name is Kevin Navertel, and I'm a political science professor at the college, and I'm also the Democracy Commitment Coordinator. And part of the Democracy Commitment initiative on our campus is try to promote civic literacy, to host events, to try to help our campus community learn more about what's going on in politics. And this is an election year, 2024. We have national elections this November. And we have a primary election this March 19th in Illinois. So thank you for being here this morning. We actually have a second event right after this on the 2024 election, the uniqueness of the 2024 election. And then the Democracy Commitment is also hosting voter registration next week on campus. Next Wednesday from 12 to 1:30 in the U building. There's going to be a voter registration drive, and then next Thursday, February 29th, from 12:30 to 2, we're going to have a voter registration table just outside this library here. So if you or anybody you know is interested in registering to vote, please show up. So today I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Mary Pfliess-Dunkel. She is also a political science faculty member. She teaches sociology, she teaches history. Is there anything I'm missing?
And I'm also the college's study abroad coordinator, so if I may also throw out a little plug, this is not Democracy Commitment, but it is the Cradle of Democracy, a study abroad trip to Greece this summer that we are trying to get off the ground. So if anyone is interested in going, or you even know family members or people in the community who would like to come and audit the course, please see me. You can always just go to the Moraine Valley website and just type in study abroad and it will come up. And my number's on there. You can send me a text message or contact me that way. And so I highly recommend you doing it. So it'd be great to go to the Cradle of Democracy and see where Socrates and Aristotle walk amongst them. So.
Awesome. All right, so today we have a lot of slides, a lot of information. I think I had, 10 or 15 pages of notes that Professor Pfliess-Dunkel turned into some slides. But we also want this to be interactive. So if at any point something on here doesn't make sense, if you have questions, if there's something you would like to talk more about, please just raise your hand and we can take questions as they come. So today's, this event was really kind of inspired thinking about how the Democrats historically have been kind of known as kind of the party of the little guy, the party of the little person, if you will. Always kind of looking out for those who have been historically kind of lower income, working class. And there's been a lot of books recently in scholarship looking at how the Democratic Party has changed. One book in particular that Professor Pfliess and I have both been reading is called Where Have All the Democrats Gone by John Judas and Rui Teixeira. And there's another book too, Party of the People, Inside the Multiracial Populist Coalition, Remaking the GOP. And I think the case that we're going to be making today is that both political parties have huge coalitions. We call them big tent parties because we have this two-party system in the United States. And for these two parties to be most competitive, they're trying to have as many different factions and groups of people under their tent, under their big umbrella to make them as competitive as possible in elections. We're going to make the case that we think in particular, both of these political parties have some groups within them that in some cases is they don't agree on all issues. And that's always been the case historically. But we're going to make the case that the Democrats in particular have a coalition that has some internal tensions and may be pulling apart, making it harder for Democrats to be competitive in national elections. And that has specific consequences, of course, for 2024. And we would argue that this upcoming election is critically important for democracy, kind of rule of law, and the Constitution. So in particular, a couple of these demographics that Democrats have really counted on in recent elections is younger people, 18 to 29-year-olds, minorities, especially African-American voters, and single women, and historically it has been working class. There was a lot of talk early in the 2000s that, especially by these same authors, they were making a case that in 2002 that Democrats were going to kind of have this permanent coalition When you look at the demographics of America, as America was becoming more college educated, sorry, I missed that demographic, college education voters, those with a college education are also a key part of the Democratic coalition. So if you start to look at some of these demographics, more and more people are getting a college degree, or the percentage of Americans who have a college degree was expected to grow from 2002 going forward. Young voters, once you vote Democrat once, you tend to stick with that political party. Of course, America was projected to be more and more increased proportion of our population that was a minority member, Latino especially, growing demographic. And so it looked like Democrats were going to have this permanent coalition. And in some ways, the 2008 election with President Obama kind of made that, realized that the potential of what the Democratic Party could be. And in 2012, Obama won re-election really easily, and it looked like their thesis was correct. And in fact, in 2012, the Republican Party did this kind of reflection. They called it like a postmortem. Trying to, how in the heck did they lose this 2012 election? The economy wasn't going so well. It looked like they expected to win that election. And one of the things that they really thought in particular was that they needed to be more competitive with Latinos in particular, and maybe open up and change their immigration stance in particular to try to be more appealing. But also to younger voters too, because they thought that they, again, had the potential to lose elections as far as the eye could see.
You could show that. It's fine if you want, just so they could see the, come back to it too. 2012 presidential election that you're referring to.
Right, so this is the Electoral College results from 2012. And those of you who know, red states are Republican states, blue states are shaded blue for voting Democrat. And this is a very overwhelming Electoral College victory. You need 270 to win. Barack Obama wins 332.
Yeah, sorry.
Maybe.
I can go back. Yeah. Okay. Here's your next one. That's the next slide.
Okay. So again, a lot of different directions for us to take, but one of the considerations that we want to make that I think in particular for the Democrats, whenever you have the party in power, there's this concept in political science called coalition of minorities. In this case, it doesn't mean racial, ethnic minorities. It just means that the party in power is going to either make decisions or lack of decisions that's going to lead to several different groups who are upset with that decision, and they're going to hold that president accountable for that decision. And so there's generally a growing list of people who are upset with that party. And we're going to make a case that there's several different issues that are really making it hard for President Biden's approval rating, and people who are suggesting that they're going to not vote in the 2024 election. Maybe they're going to vote for a third party. Maybe they sit out the election altogether. Maybe they vote for former President Trump as kind of a protest vote.
So here's a question. I have to stand because I don't do as well sometimes when I do better when I'm walking around. How many of you have concerns, just in this audience, about either of the candidates' age? You don't have to say what they are, just whether you're concerned about them. Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of a fair question, right? And that's something that's come up and that we're going to be discussing throughout actually both of our presentations. So I put together a couple of things here. The idea of as Professor Navratil was talking about, these parties we've got two major parties, right? Two major political parties. And oftentimes I think people feel a little bit of this sense of discontent because they often don't fit that they feel maybe they fit in either one, or sometimes they want to vote for one candidate or versus another, but you're stuck with these two political parties and there's not a lot of room in the middle. And so I did a little bit of a Google search looking just putting in Democrats and Biden running for a second term. And this is a list that, just the first 5 of them showed up here. There's a ton of them that are on here though about whether or not Joe Biden should run for a second term and how much internal disagreement and disaccord there is about whether or not Biden should seek a second term. Now, at this point in the game, it's a little bit late in the game. It's not impossible for him to drop out. It has been done. There is precedent for it. The last time that a president did this was actually a Democratic president in 1968, Lyndon Johnson, who was facing some tough primary challengers. And in March 31st of 1968 announced gave this like normal address on TV, and at the end of it was like, well, guess what, y'all? I'm not seeking re-election, and sort of took the whole country by storm, which set up kind of a chaotic debate when it came time for the convention in the summer to choose who was going to be the next nominee. If you look at some of these headlines, it's the idea that there's not a backup plan. Could they replace him, et cetera, et cetera? What would happen? Now, one thing that Joe Biden did say that's been brought up a lot, especially in the recent weeks, with the emergence of a report regarding, and it was where there was a questioning of his mental capacities, and that's a whole other issue, and regarding classified information that was not only affecting him but multiple other politicians. Was one thing that Joe Biden said when he ran, when he was elected, was the idea that he envisioned himself as a bridge to a new generation. Now, he never came out and said, I'm only seeking one term and then I'm going to drop out. But it was sort of the implication that I think many people sort of took him at this word, that he was only going to be seeking one term. And then as time went on, of course, that did not end up happening. Now, this is a CBS News poll from December of 2023 of Democrats asking, kind of their thoughts on the election. So one of them is whether he should run. Now, the majority are saying 60-40 that he should run. It's not. It is a yes, but I mean there is like about over a third of the electorate saying no. Underneath there, what are the major concerns? The first one, 93%, is his age. He's 81 years old right now, so he will be the oldest president ever to be running. And just to give you guys a little bit of context for the audience, when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election in '84, he was running as the oldest president seeking a re-election, and on the debate stage, and at the time he was in his 70s. And there was this kind of joke about whether or not he was, and he made a joke about it in the debate with Walter Mondale, his candidate, something to the effect of, well, I'm not going to exploit my opponent's age and lack of experience for political gain. And it became this big joke, and Walter Mondale said right at that moment that he knew that he lost. So age is not necessarily, does not guarantee that you're going to lose an election. It certainly did not mean that for Ronald Reagan. The second one on here, though, is concerns about whether or not he would be able to finish out his second term. And then the third one on here, about 62% saying that it's time for somebody new to be jumping in. So these are kind of the results of the CBS poll, and then an Associated Press poll that kind of hones a little bit focused more on what Professor Navratil and I are talking about, is the idea of looking at where, like how this is skewing. And particularly if you're looking at here, the biggest number of people that have this concern within the Democratic coalition are younger voters, voters ages 18 to 44, who have this concern about whether or not he should seek re-election. Again, it's 37% in this poll saying that he should run. This is from February of 2024, and is down from 52% that was in October. So these are now again. This does not mean that it's all is lost and we should run screaming from no. There's a long time before the election comes around, but these are definitely startling and some concerning numbers. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little bit about why these divides in the party, in all parties, actually matter, but particularly with the Democrats.
So there are experts who would argue that this topic is unnecessary for us to be discussing today. There's one in particular, Simon Rosenberg. He was interviewed by Ezra Klein in the Ezra Klein podcast about how Democrats have been winning national elections. 2018, they took back the House of Representatives. 2020, they won the presidency back, maintained the House of Representatives, won narrowly the Senate. 2022, they increased their Senate majority by one senator, and they only lost the House of Representatives by about 5 votes, or 5 total members. Around 6,000 total votes accounted for those 5 members. And then in a lot of these special elections, Democrats have been winning, and in many statewide elections, governor's races, Democrats have been winning. So it's like, why are we talking about the Democrats having this, being in a problem scenario?
And well, if I may jump into in the last 24 years, the last presidential elections, Democrats have only lost the popular vote in 1 of those elections since in 2004. So
right. So as we know, in 2016, in the Electoral College, Donald Trump won the majority. If you could just leave back one.
Yeah. Go back to this one.
Yeah. So Democrats lost the Electoral College in 2016, but won the popular vote by about 2.7 million votes. It was 3 states in 2016 that Donald Trump was able to win that were really key: Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And it was by about a combined 78,000 votes, which is, almost like, I don't know, Wrigley Field and the United Center kind of combined, essentially, right? And the amount of people who would fit into those stadiums, but spread out across 3 states. So just super close elections. And also in 2020, when Biden won the presidency, it was by an even smaller margin, just around 45,000 votes, which again is just like one of our 2 major sports teams in Chicago, their baseball team stadium. So it's just a really narrow victory in 2020. And we expect 2024 to be close as well. And one of the things I think the authors of this book that I referenced earlier, again, Judas and Teixeira, are saying is that Democrats should really be looking in the mirror and kind of realizing 2 things: that there is this kind of anti-MAGA coalition that generally has showed up in elections, especially suburban voters who maybe feel like, they might be conservative or Republican leaning or independent, but they just feel like, the Trump presidency was too much, or some of the things, election denialism and things along those lines maybe pushed them too far. But that this isn't a permanent voting coalition that the Democrats can count on, suburban voters, and so that they need to kind of look in the mirror and understand that why Trump was successful in 2016, why he was nearly successful in 2020, and arguably if the election was today, I think many odds makers would put Trump as the leader. If the election was held today, there's a good chance that Donald Trump would win re-election. And so Democrats really need to look in the mirror and understand why, in particular, are they not so competitive with this group of people who historically have been in their wheelhouse? Working class voters, white working class voters in particular, so people without a college education. Oftentimes it's people who work with their hands. Another way of conceptualizing this is that people who work for hourly wages or don't have a salary. And I will acknowledge that there is a little bit of subjectivity here of what is working class. But traditionally those without a college degree, and traditionally those who are non-salaried.
And just to offer some context, I know for those of you who are in Professor Navratil's class, you're probably very familiar with this, but for some maybe who have been coming in, just to offer a little bit of kind of historical context. What we're talking about when we say like the Rust Belt or the Frost Belt, or kind of like these terms that we're throwing out here, that traditionally speaking, areas that were kind of the industrial Midwest, right? So the states that Professor Navratil was talking about that were traditionally Democratic strongholds, right? Like you look at Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Indiana. Traditionally, these states here have been losing population. In the last, 30, 40 years, people have been moving down south. And every time we redo the census, every 10 years, these states, for the most part, with the exception of a few, tend to be gaining numbers, and the states up here in the north tend to be losing numbers. We tend to be losing 1 or 2 electoral votes each time, based on the fact that the population's moving. So this idea that if you're looking at the electoral votes, the electoral victory in 2012, Obama having taken Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, lost Indiana, but then in 2016, Hillary Clinton losing Wisconsin, Michigan, as Professor Navratil mentioned. I mean, this was referred to as the Democratic blue wall, right? The wall that was supposed to hold, that had been holding, this goes back to even the New Deal, to the time of Franklin Roosevelt, and getting these working class voters on this side. So this shifted, was this a shift of like a historical significance? But then you look at 2020, and then Joe Biden wins back, as Professor Navratil mentioned, by these very slim numbers, at least Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, not Ohio. Okay. So if we mentioned already this idea that, as Professor Navratil was saying in the beginning, this idea of being associated with the working class, this New Deal coalition that starts to happen in the 1930s when the Great Depression happened. And Franklin Roosevelt is president, he's a Democratic president, and he gathers together voters from across lots of different spectrums. African-American men, who traditionally were the only ones that could vote, and in small numbers there too, voted Republican, because Republicans were the party of Lincoln. But this shift starts to occur in the 1930s, where the Democratic Party now becomes affiliated as the party of, as Professor Navratil said, the little guy, right? These programs like Social Security, these programs that eventually become, later on in Johnson's administration in the 60s, Medicare and Medicaid, unemployment insurance, all those things that never existed before, that, sorry, if you lost your job, oh well, you were out of luck. There was nothing to bail you out. There was no mechanism for you to have a retirement package when you retired. That was it. There was nothing. You had an injury. Oh well. Good luck. Hope that works out well for you. So this coalition has held for a long time. Now, what is happening to this coalition? So as we talked about earlier, you're starting to see these demographics changing, right? This idea that Democrats that have a college degree, that number has doubled, and that the numbers are skewing of non-college voters are tending to be higher and higher in number and are starting to trend more and more voting for the Republican Party. In the 2016 election, this gap became ever even wider. I forgot to put a citation in there. Where white working class voters in Iowa and Ohio, you're seeing like these much bigger margins, 22 and 15 points towards the Republican Party, and then Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, like 8 points, 11 points, 13 points in those different states respectively. So these are big numbers. Again, for states where the Democratic Party traditionally relied on them as reliable voters. That was one of the criticisms of the Clinton campaign, was that she didn't campaign hard enough in those states and sort of took those voters for granted. Those voters who felt marginalized, those voters who felt that they've been left behind, and now we're going to be yeah, sure. This one or further?
One more.
This one? Yeah.
So I'm sure you can read the slide, but I just want to reiterate that historically the biggest divide between Democrats and Republicans were you could kind of, and one thing we should say here with all of these groups, so when we use demographics based on age, race, ethnicity, education, and so on, we're making generalizations. We see strong trends where maybe 60% of the people in one of these groups might vote for one party over the other. But clearly that doesn't mean everybody, and it isn't determinative just because you're in one of these groups. That being said, historically it looked like higher income people above $100,000, for example, or above $250,000 were largely Republican. And historically, big differences between Democrats and Republicans were over like tax policy, redistributive policy, social spending programs. The biggest divide today is largely between the non-college educated and the college educated. And that 35% gap, so this is from a recent New York Times Siena poll, where Biden is favored by 22 points among those with a college degree, and Trump is ahead with those without a college degree by 13 points. So when you add the 22 and 13, that's how we get 35. So this is predicted for 2024 as of this last month. In 2020, this college, non-college divide was only 22 points. So it's gone up from 22 to 35 in just this 4-year time period. So it is something that is growing. And one of the problems for Democrats is that the majority of the country does not have a college education. And we were showing you those Rust Belt states in particular, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. The percentage of people with a college degree in those 3 states are actually lower than the national average. So in essence, there's more whites without a college degree, which are seemingly in the wheelhouse of the Republicans in those 3 states. And can you go back one more slide? Is estimated that in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have won those same 3 states that we were talking about had she just reduced the difference between the working class vote that Obama received in 2012 to the working class vote that she received in 2016. If she could have just reduced the deficit by 25% in those 3 states, she would have easily won re-election. So it is really consequential. I'm sure it's not surprising to you when you're losing elections by 20,000 votes in a specific state, every vote really matters. And so this is something that I think Democrats should be really worried about.
I think I include this in there. When we skip it?
Yeah, Mary already covered this, but I think one thing that just to reiterate, I don't know that we can say this too many times, it isn't just white working class people that that Democrats are shedding support amongst. It is working class people of all races and ethnicities. And historically, Democrats have been receiving like 90% of the vote of African Americans, something like 70% Latinos. So this is a problem to see for Democrats to see these numbers shedding.
And then this slide here is just giving you kind of a breakdown from the 1948 presidential elections all the way through till 2012. And you're seeing some different trends here, like during the Vietnam War, but times where there's been a spike of white working class support for Republicans going up, and then of course trending downward. 1992, during the year that Bill Clinton won, spiking up again during the George W. Bush years, and then kind of decreasing again during when Obama was elected. And then again, since 2012, that number's been kind of skewing upward. And then, of course, again, the idea, though, that is important to stress, and I'm sorry that this is not the clearest slide, but just the idea that how do we, in sociology, you talk about the idea about social class all the time, right? How do you define social class? In places like, the UK, social class is very firmly defined. Here, we tend to look at things like, income tends to be usually the factor that people bring up the most. But there's other things too, right? Education being another one. And then, of course, the combined of income and education. So how do we reclassify the idea of working class is also up for grabs too. And then just another graph here yet again, tracking from 1980, again, showing that from 2016 onward, this number of kind of working class voters, in this case, white working class voters, skewing more towards the Republican Party and away from the...
And just real quick, just noticing, this is American National Election Survey. If you look from 2008, again, this is this huge Obama victory.
You do see a dip there between 2008 and 2012, and then...
So huge change in just from 2008 to 2020.
Right, yeah. So as we just said, about the idea of like income no longer being like the biggest predictor of vote. And again, some of these things are things that we've already talked about. But in a recent poll that NBC News did, there's only just 2 percentage points, which this never used to be the case. That, Democrats used to always, whereas Republicans would always score higher when it came to national security, Democrats used to always have much higher percentage points of looking out for, again, the working class, or so-called like the little guy. But in this recent poll shows that basically they're losing that advantage too. So again, what does that suggest? What does that mean? And even again, this idea of this decline in working class voters of color. Because what's interesting is that in the last election in 2020, while Biden did better in getting some of those suburbanites out to vote for him, kind of recapturing some of the people that were lost in 2020, Trump actually did better amongst minority voters in 2020. He captured a higher percentage of the black vote and of the Latino vote than he did before, especially in particular areas like in Texas and in Florida. So that in and of itself is also another interesting trend to be watching.
I want to say one thing too.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as Mary pointed out, this is a 2% gap between Democrats and Republicans. And this is from the September 2023 NBC News survey. For a 30-year time period, Democrats had held a minimum of a 29-point advantage in this question of who's looking out after the middle class. So again, this is just a really stark perception amongst voters of who's looking out after the middle class. It's a really radical change of people not viewing the Democrats as looking out after the middle class.
You want to this one?
Yeah, this is a question that actually came up in my American government class a couple of weeks ago. So some of you who are in that American government class will recognize this. And we should know that there isn't any magic bullet that fully explains the trends that we've been talking about. But I do think that what we have up on the screen now, and we can pinpoint this as kind of a work in progress, but let's say from 1980 onward, there's been a major change in our economy. And one of those major changes is manufacturing's been on the decline. You could also look at some other industries as well, mining and extraction, textile work, but factory work in particular has really been on the decline. And some policies have led to this. It's hard to have enough time to cover all of them, but especially in the 1990s, we had the North America Free Trade Agreement, where there's free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Numerous benefits of lower prices and increased goods and more selection, but estimates that at least 1 million jobs were lost, especially, and when we say jobs were lost, jobs are usually concentrated into, they're not evenly distributed with 1 million job losses all throughout the United States. A lot of these were disproportionately in some of those when we're referring to the Rust Belt of the Michigans and the Ohios and the Wisconsins and Pennsylvanias. starting in the late 1990s, China got special treatment for trade policy and eventually was added into the World Trade Organization. So now you have this huge producer of low-cost goods that are being flooded into the United States and other developed parts of the world, bringing down prices. Many offshoring jobs that used to be in the United States being relocated in lower cost parts of the world. So collectively, we refer to these as kind of neoliberalism policies. They are making free trade easier. The idea is kind of bringing down tariffs and quotas and non-tariff barriers, making free trade easier. The idea is that it's going to lift all boats. It's going to increase the number of goods and services that we have available to consumers. And I think it's without argument that consumers have benefited in a lot of different ways. It's also, I think, without argument that there's been certain industries that have really benefited. And a lot of these have been Wall Street, tech firms, and a lot of these benefits have been kind of concentrated to specific parts of the United States. I think disproportionately parts of the coast, the Northeast and the far West, California in particular, but also some of these parts of the country, including Chicago, that have a disproportionate number of college-educated people, high-tech firms, banking, and I would also point out like Silicon Valley. So there's been a lot, and then increased technology changes, automation, where people are being replaced by robots or other increased technology that reduces the need for workers. And so when you look around America, and some of us may recognize this based on where you've traveled, where maybe you've lived, some communities have really been kind of hollowed out. They lose a major factory, and it just devastates that town. And then other parts of the country have been doing really well in terms of the industries that I've pointed out were winners of this kind of these changes in our economy. So these are really kind of massive changes that we've experienced over the last several decades. And I think these are, in large part, account for part of the changes that we've been referring to. So that's kind of the economic argument. But then I also think, as we were pointing out how Democrats have become more college educated as a proportion of their constituency has doubled the number of people with college education, and we're seeing this huge divide between those with and without a college education. Now, again, this is coming from authors, from this book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone, and others. This, again, is John Judas and Rui Teixeira. But they're making a point that the Democrats in particular, one of the reasons that they're shedding the working class votes, again, of all race and ethnicities, but especially white working class people, is that there has been a greater emphasis on kind of cultural, social issues, and decrease of kind of the kitchen table issues of maybe higher taxes on the rich that are going to pay for universal benefits for people that are going to help the working class. Could be increased child care, could be health care. And so as they've shifted more, and again, part of this is, perception is reality. So part of it is the way that voters and citizens have perceived the Democratic Party is changing on the type of issues that they've focused on.
Right, because it's interesting, because there's still, if you look at even at Biden's record, I was listening to a podcast, and Senator Elizabeth Warren was on there, and she was talking about just the idea that even the price of insulin has been basically kind of fixed and concentrated at like about $35 for people, whereas people were having to choose, seniors were having to choose between whether or not they could pay for their insulin or whether they could pay for food. So they haven't completely lost touch with a lot of these issues, but again, as Kevin said, the perception becomes reality, and it doesn't matter what you throw at people. If the perception if that perception is people's reality, no amount of facts being thrown at people is going to make a difference of changing that. Okay, so you want to talk the first part at least about because that was one that you put in.
Yeah. So part of this is, and this isn't specific to the United States, there's an argument that as societies get richer, And in some ways, this might be taking, and I'm not a psychologist, but taking from somebody like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that as more of your basic needs are being met, then you're able to focus on other non-material issues. So that's what this first point is trying to make a claim of, is so as societies get richer, they're going to be focusing more on equality and social justice and equity and things that might not be as traditional in terms of economic redistributive policies. So I just want to quickly show this. This is from academics from Ronald Inglehart to Thomas Piketty have written about how when Western societies grow richer, voters stop voting for the party aligned with their class interests and vote for one party that represents their cultural interests. This means that more support among wealthy elites for the left and more support for working class non-college graduates for the right. And this is from the Emerging Working Class Republican Majority.
Some of the other things that have been discussed about in terms of critiques of the Democratic Party, or at least that contribute to the schism within the Democratic Party. And I'm sure that you guys have heard of some of these things, if you've seen them on social media or et cetera. But even just the idea of phrasing in the aftermath of the George Floyd shooting in 2020, but the notion of even defund the police, and the use of that term, even though very few Democratic politicians were actually using that term. The majority of them kind of distanced themselves from that, but there were a few who did. But then it became sort of associated with as the moniker of the entire party, and whether that's a practical thing, especially if you look at the idea that studies showed and polls that showed that people that were living in neighborhoods, in minority neighborhoods, African Americans and Hispanics, were asking for, instead of not necessarily wanting more police presence, but at least to have a safe neighborhood. So not wanting police to be defunded, therefore making a neighborhood less safe. So there's been kind of a bit of a backlash or discussion occurring as to whether or not how useful of a phrase that was. And also in the terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, and even the term wokeism, right? The idea of whether or not this is policies, have they gone too far as policies, and the effectiveness of some of the policies. And again, we're not here to give you tell you our opinions on them. We're just more giving you this is the snapshot of the discussions that are happening in and around the Democratic Party now, and what kind of impact these are having on the Democratic Party and on voters.
And part of this too is not, and the authors make this claim, and I think other people who share their concerns, it isn't that any one of these issues is not important. Right. They are important. Part of it is what you're prioritizing, and then secondly, and I think their bigger point is how are you treating people who might disagree with a part of this, or the way that it's focused, or not using the right terminology. And amongst some people, especially the really educated left and the real activist left, it is, almost like sacrilegious to not use the appropriate terms or not to have the right view. And they give plenty of examples of people essentially being canceled, and that this is making the Democratic Party in particular more insular and less able to reach a larger audience, especially working class voters who may not share kind of the same views on some of these topics. We're also going to talk about immigration and a couple other topics too. But that's really the focus, that how you prioritize issues, how you speak about them, and then do you even allow any sort of dissension or alternative views on some of these topics? And their argument is that Democrats have increasingly not been as tolerant of views that might be dissenting from what they consider the only way of looking at this. It's very black and white, if you will.
The orthodoxy of the party.
Yeah, it's very orthodoxical.
Yeah. Another one is concerns around LGBTQIA issues. For one, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this, just again seeing it on social media, about the participation of trans athletes in sports. There's even discussion now about swimming in the Olympic Games that are coming up this summer, and how that should play out. And it was an interesting poll that shows that in 2 years ago, 62% of Americans agreed that trans athletes should play on teams that conform to their birth gender, and now that number has risen actually to 69%. So there seems to be definitely like a backlash to these issues, or at least the way in which they are being discussed. I think sometimes nuance is lost in a lot of these conversations, and that seems to be kind of part of the problem. And then, of course, as Kevin already mentioned, immigration. So again, perception is reality, right? And this is in Congress. If you've been following the news at all lately, Congress has been attempting to try to deal with this issue. But that you have a poll of like 68% of overall Americans, not just Democrats, are disapproving the way that Biden has been handling border security. And so one of the issues that we discussed as we were kind of going through this was the idea that back in 2020 in the primary, and again, just for those of you who are non-political science students to understand, who votes for candidates in the primaries? It's usually like the orthodox of the party, the people who are the party faithful, right? So if people that tend to believe in these issues the most fervently. And in 2020, when you have these different presidential candidates who were running, the majority of the presidential candidates agreed that they would extend healthcare benefits to undocumented immigrants. Now, some of you may think that, why shouldn't we? Healthcare should maybe be a right for everybody. It's a human right, et cetera, et cetera. That also tends to be something that's kind of out of line with the majority public opinion of most Americans. Again, right or wrong, we're not placing a judgment on it. That is just another example of kind of that maybe walking out of step with what perhaps some more like working class voters believe. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just say that immigration issue is arguably one of the most important issues that working class people in particular feel like the Democrats haven't been as responsive to as they should. And I think can, in a large part, account for why we're seeing, especially in that industrial area, the Rust Belt, and places like, we haven't really mentioned Ohio and Iowa, but both of those two states voted for Obama twice. And then we could even look at even border communities that have, 75% or more of their of the citizens are Latino, and you're seeing huge changes of voting for Democrat to now voting for Republican. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is Donald Trump, and you could be thinking about whether it was from the very beginning in 2015 and his campaign for 2016, the rhetoric that he used. I think in a lot of ways, people like us, political scientists and others in academia are like, oh, that language is certainly going to be turning off for Latino voters, and some of the policies, the child separation policies at the border, and the list goes on and on, but yet you're not seeing that. And so it's nuanced. There could be many different reasons explaining this, one of which is that even Latino people are very supportive of strong border policy, and or that they prioritize more of the kitchen table economic issues. Some of it could have been that during COVID, they didn't want there to be the stringent policies, and they wanted more of the economy to be opened up. So I'm not trying to say it's only one issue, but to see the trend of Democrats losing voter support from key constituencies that have been just instrumental in their victories historically is something that should be alarming for Democratic strategists.
Yeah. And again, perception being reality. And of course, Israel and Palestine. This has been kind of what the big, again, we kept talking about elephants in the room, but this has been a huge one for the Democratic Party and has caused a major schism. And for those of you that have been, whether you've been on TikTok or you've been following, I'm sure you've seen things, whether it's even about discussions about Starbucks and McDonald's, and that's a whole other issue. But just the idea of it being in a forefront, especially for young people. And so it's not a surprise that since since October 7th, Joe Biden has lost a pretty significant chunk. We're looking almost 10% of voters under the age of 35. So that's a pretty big number. Now, in the case of the state of Michigan, that has one of the highest populations of Arab Americans outside of Palestine. It's like Ramallah in Palestine, and then it's Dearborn, Michigan. That is one of the highest numbers of population of Arab Americans. Michigan, like in the last election, was a swing state. It has been for some time. The number, what was do you remember the number of the amount of votes? How many thousands of votes did Biden win? The percentage it was
over 100,000 for 2000
for 2020.
For 2020, but 2016 it was 11,000 votes.
Right. So what would that mean then if people are sitting out, as many voters are saying now they're going to sit out in 2024 as a protest vote, right? In response to how the Biden administration has been handling its policy towards Israel. And I want to just be clear, this is a policy that, foreign policy are things that usually presidents can have an impact on foreign policy, right? It's not like they don't have an impact. But a lot of these policies are crafted over years from diplomats in the State Department. These are bureaucrats who are there at their desks. They've been doing their work for decades in many cases. And so some of the policies that are there have already been in place. Now, again, a president, I'm not saying they cannot have an impact, but the U.S.'s long supporting support for Israel is now really starting to cause a schism that didn't exist before. I remember, I think it was Obama, wasn't it in 2008, in the primary, was talking, he was the first presidential candidate I had ever heard talk about the idea of much more open rhetoric about Israel's policies towards Palestine and wanting to have a softer approach and a better approach. His stance seemed to kind of become much more centered and a little bit more pro-Israel after he was elected. And I think that kind of is, unfortunately, sort of part and parcel with the job, right? But it is definitely, this has been caused probably one of the most starkest schisms. I don't know if you would agree with that, but it's been a huge one.
Yeah, we did not save this issue for last because it's the least important. I would argue that this could be with immigration, but this single-handedly could lose Biden the election. There's just no doubt about this. It cannot overemphasize the divides internally within the Democrats on this issue alone. There's divides, many on the left, especially younger people who have kind of grown up in an era where all they have seen is kind of the Netanyahu government of Israel and how awful that they have been in regards towards Palestine. And so there's huge opposition, especially amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, where really all Americans under the age of 40 are very, very critical of Israel, very, very critical of the way that Israel has handled this war, and really holding Biden responsible for not being stronger in trying to in issuing a ceasefire, putting more pressure on Netanyahu. But we should, as was pointed out on this PowerPoint slide, there's also, people who are Jewish who are also upset, feeling like, wait a minute, we have been a bedrock in the Democratic coalition for decades, generations, and we feel kind of abandoned here. That where was the "I stand with Israel" or where was the support for the atrocities that happened on October 7th, and feeling like that their views and interests aren't really being respected, and feeling so I cannot overemphasize how this issue is really, really. Biden has sent campaign members and strategists to places like Dearborn, Michigan. It might be too little, too late. There is a movement called #AbandonBiden, and there are hundreds of thousands of people who are part of this movement, and they are trying to organize in battleground swing states. And their argument is that they're completely fine if they are the reason that Biden and Democrats lose the 2024 election, because they want to be taken seriously as a voting group and making sure that their interests are going to be more accounted for going forward in 2028 and in the future.
And I think just one thing that strikes me, just personally, just how interesting it is that you have these two viewpoints that are kind of like counterpoint of one another, but that almost like are mirrors of one another. You've got liberal Jews feeling abandoned. And by the way, that Jews should have been capitalized. It was originally. I was saying to Kevin on the original PowerPoint, things sometimes get lowercase when you change the font. Anyway. But both groups, pro-Palestinian groups and liberal Jewish groups, feel that they are also either being abandoned or being targeted. So it's interesting that they're both kind of expressing similar sentiments. And just so a couple things here. So some of the data that we got was from this New York Times article about Democrats being divided over Israel. A resolution was passed condemning the October 7th attacks by Hamas. And again, I think this is kind of just noting that times have changed, right? We're in a new era here where it did pass, but you had 9 Democrats who voted against it, which traditionally that would not have been something that Democrats would have done. Or I mean, you may have had 1 or 2 outliers. You had 1 Republican that went along with it, but 6 of them who voted present, which is kind of like my way of saying I'm not going to take a stance and I'm taking kind of the way out of it. Same thing on the side of the Senate, where Bernie Sanders tried to pass something, and still is actually, he along with Elizabeth Warren, of the idea of placing some stricter conditions on aid, not just to Israel, but to other states as well, but particularly in this case to Israel. And it only got 11 votes in the Senate. So just saying that he's not going to be sending any more money to the Netanyahu government, and so this is definitely showing a if you are a Democrat or if you share these views, a concerning trend. Like what is this in fact going to mean for 2024? Oh, let me leave it there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is a great opportunity. We still have about 25 minutes, and we haven't had any questions or comments yet. So please, we now turn it over to you. Anything that we've covered, anything that we missed, related questions, comments, reactions that you may have.
And I have a microphone, so raise your hand and I will come to you.
So it can be recorded on YouTube, so that's why. Don't be embarrassed. There's no dumb questions or comments, even if you have a comment you'd like to make.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, hold on 1 second. Microphone's coming.
Can I ask you a question about Trump versus Biden on some of these issues?
You can ask any question you want.
Do you think Trump is really better positioned on these last 2 points you've made about being blind about pro-Israel support and the immigration thing in light of the stand that he's taken? I mean, historically, I don't think he's better positioned than Biden on those two issues, even though he seems to have twisted it around so that he's making a pretty strong case for re-election and to make big issues out of these things, I think. Do you think that Trump's better positioned than Biden on those issues?
I'll start, unless you wanted to.
No, go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
but perception is reality, and I think if you look at public opinion polls in terms of who voters trust on the border, Trump gets much higher marks. I'm pulling this from. I can pull up some data to try to show the evidence for that. Trump has been talking about creating detention centers. We'll talk more about that at our next upcoming event. Going into sanctuary cities like Chicago and deporting people, having a border wall. I mean, he's talked all about the building of the wall and so forth. So, and then you just look at the raw numbers of the number of migrants who came into the United States during the Trump administration, during the Biden administration. I think voters are going to give him higher marks on that issue. And I think that issue is a more prominent issue than maybe issues that Democrats might be competitive on. In terms of the Israel-Palestine issue, again, I struggle to say, I try to be objective in this. What I would say to Democratic voters, where this issue is something that they're very passionate about, is to not have amnesia and remember who was president from 2006, 2017 to 2021. If this is the issue you're most concerned about, I have a lot of reservations about this hashtag abandon Biden. And we're talking about policies like a travel ban that disproportionately was targeted to Muslim majority countries. You talk about the rhetoric that he had. If you look at who do you think Netanyahu wants to be president? It's something I really, and without putting too much of my own views out there, should Biden be doing more? Absolutely. Has Biden been doing a lot behind the scenes of pressuring Netanyahu? Absolutely. Is Netanyahu listening? Not at all. And maybe to a certain degree, he's changed policies, and maybe it would be even more aggressive without what Biden's doing.
Yeah.
But I could show you clip after clip, whether it was Obama was president, in the presence of Netanyahu saying no more settlements. Netanyahu goes back and adds more settlements. They have not listened to the United States. I do not buy the argument that the United States has the leverage that people think that they do. And I do think that people can be very, very upset for that and put pressure on Biden. That is part of the democratic process. But to think that things are magically going to be better under Netanyahu and Israel's policy under a Trump presidency, I think people are just flat out wrong on that.
Yeah. To echo Kevin's point, it was the Trump administration, as I mentioned before about foreign policy, that actually moved the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, handing the right-wing government in Israel a huge victory that they had desired for a long time. He came up with a peace plan for the Palestinians that included no Palestinians in in any of the talks. It was this plan that was completely, I mean, pretty much just rejected as being like a joke by Palestinian groups. In terms of Trump, when it comes to immigration, legal immigration decreased while Trump was president. Legal immigration decreased. So the idea of people, again, perception is reality. Kevin's absolutely right about that. But I think the problem is due to our dory short-term memory loss issues that we all have because of social media, because our attention spans are like this fast, we tend to forget what just happened just a couple of years ago. So I just remember even on this campus having discussions about, and I think we had some seminars and talks about the Muslim ban and things that he did literally within like a week of being in office. So again, yeah, I mean, it's always, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. In this case, we kind of know both. So, I would argue that, just from an objective, I think it's pretty objective. There's plenty of data to back it up that Trump would definitely not do a better job when it comes to that.
So how do you guys feel about this new conversation that it's more going to be Kamala versus Trump? Like, people are thinking that Biden's going to eventually step down, and it's going to be more like Kamala's our president than Biden if he gets elected.
Are you talking about that rumor that's kind of going around that's not really been substantiated, or that's just sort of, yeah?
Yeah.
I wouldn't really put too much, you know what she's talking about? Yeah, it's
Well,
I wouldn't put too much faith in it, but.
yeah, I think that there is some rumors / conspiracy theories that, Biden's just this kind of placeholder, and, whether it's Michelle Obama or, Kamala's going to take his place once you get through the convention. I don't put much credence into that, but I do think it is worth considering, and Democrat strategists, some of which, even people like David Axelrod, who helped be a key part of Obama's campaign, questioning whether a Biden should continue to run, and just looking at kind of an actuarial standpoint, somebody who is the 81, I forget how old he is, and just maybe the way that he has physically presented himself over the last few years, and whether that's declined of just his life expectancy and the likelihood that maybe he could decline further between, is it February? February 20th, we got until November 5th. It's a long time. Even I mentioned Ezra Klein once. He had a recent podcast basically saying Democrats should potentially go into the convention and maybe pick a different candidate. And so I would just say that there are many people in circles thinking the thoughts that you just had. Whether it's Kamala, she is the vice president. I think that she was picked for a reason. I think she has a lot of great skill sets. Unfortunately, some of her approval ratings are actually lower than Obama's. I'm sorry, Biden's, here I go. Give me the
We
dementia.
all have our moments.
Give me the dementia test too. There's a couple different ways of saying this. Higher negativity ratings than Biden does. If I was a Democratic strategist, you really kind of have to have laser focus. Which candidates are going to be best positioned in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and or Georgia, Arizona, and maybe North Carolina. And Kamala might be more competitive in those latter ones, in part based on demographics, more college-educated people, higher percentage of minorities. But I remember saying this when Trump was elected in 2016, that I thought Democrats' best candidate was Joe Biden, in part because of the first 3 states that I mentioned. And I think he did do pretty well of bringing back some of those white working class people and doing well in the suburbs. But I think what Democrats need to figure out for the future is, as more of their demographics are becoming more college educated, and as they're shedding the working class, how are they going to piece together not just an electoral college strategy to win the states that I just mentioned, but those same 6 states and a handful of others are key to which party has a majority in the Senate, and which governor's race are going to be winning. So I think that those states are going to be really, really key. So it's a fair question.
Yeah. And again, as I said earlier, it would require, I think in order for those delegates, 4,000 number of delegates to show up to the convention, to have to switch to Kamala Harris would require basically Joe Biden going up there and saying, I'm not running again. I want all my delegates now vote for Kamala Harris. It doesn't seem likely that he would do that. Now, if he passed away sometime between now and election day, she would become president, but that wouldn't also guarantee that she would get all the delegates at the convention either. So, which is kind of a separate issue from as Kevin mentioned, like the sort of the conspiracy theories that are out there. So thank you, good question. Other questions? I think I have 2 questions, yeah. You got one up here too after Troy. No, go ahead.
For clarification, you said that the working class is now higher educated. Was that correct? I'm sorry.
No, that the working class voters who do not have a college education are voting now more for Republicans than they are for Democrats.
And the Democratic Party as a whole has doubled the number of people with a college education who are Democrat, has doubled in recent years.
And now they're voting Republican.
The college educated people are disproportionately voting Democrat.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Where was the other question?
Right up here, this gentleman here.
Yes, Lamont. Long-time listener, first-time caller. No. I have about 2 questions. One, considering the fact that people around their 60s, 70s, or higher, they would seem to be considered like mentally unfit to, take care of their own jobs. Who in the right mind would think that they should be the ones to exclusively run the country? And 2, how do you think we should deal with the fact that Netanyahu is not exactly listening to the members of like the UN, like to, bring in negotiations about a possible ceasefire?
Mm-hmm. So the first part of your question about the 60s and the 70s, I guess as somebody who's not that far off from the 60s and 70s, I'm going to take a little bit of umbrage to it because, so I mean, yeah. So and I get it, right? You're like when you're young, anyone that seems like they're above, even in their 40s, seems like they are just like over the hill and ready. But is everyone that's necessarily of a certain age the same way? Are they all created equal? Are they all the same age? Are they all going to be necessarily demented? I don't know if you remember, this may be like sort of an exception, but it's a notable exception in my opinion. Do you remember ever hearing about an airline that landed on the Hudson River?
Yes.
Yeah. That was flown by, was it U.S. Airways, I think it was? Was it U.S. Air? I think it was still flying at the time. It was a guy, Captain Sully Sullenberger, and I believe he was 60 at the time, or around 60. And it was said that the reason that he was able to just accomplish this feat was because he was the age he was at and had the years of flying experience that he had. Now, I'm not going to deny the fact that there are things that happen, like when you do get older, you get more tired easily. I see that now in my 40s, right? That does happen. Is this concerning, or are we good?
Yeah, they're getting the key.
Oh, got it. Okay. But it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has lost complete use of their faculties and is not able to. By all accounts, those that work with Joe Biden, even Republicans like Kevin McCarthy, who was the former speaker, came out and said, listen, I've got disagreements with Joe Biden, but Joe Biden's not demented. You have conversations with him, he's fine. He's always had a stutter. The older that he's gotten, he's developed more of a shuffle to his gait, so he's walking more slowly. And I think, again, from the looks of it, right, it looks from the outside that he is just older and is not able to but by all accounts, he is still doing okay. Now, does that matter, though, if everyone's perception of him, though, is that he is this, demented old man that needs to be in a nursing home, right? Does that even matter if that's what the perception is? Because the perception becomes the reality. So definitely they need to do a better job. Joe Biden has to do a better job of being out in public more. And he does do best when he's in situations like last year at the State of the Union, in the middle of it and just kind of like he began to get heckled and just kind of started this kind of back and forth and kind of showed some pretty decent political masterminding going on. So there is definitely evidence that he's not lost it completely and that he's completely out of it. But there's also evidence that he is slower. But there is definitely a PR problem, no doubt. There is a PR problem on their hands about having to do a better job showing that he is. But is that going to make a difference? I guess whether he goes on TikTok, I think Jon Stewart was saying who goes on TikTok and looks older? He went on TikTok and did does it make a difference if he's on TikTok and he's showing will that kind of reach a younger audience? I don't know.
Yeah, it's both great questions. I'll spend more time, I think, on the first one. I think that as you age, you have more wisdom, and I think that you've got more experiences. When you're president, it's not a math test. It's a different skill set, and being able to have wisdom and being able to be surrounded by a great team is really important. I do think how he has governed or led as president is one thing, and you could look at numerous accomplishments. I mean, this is Russia invading Ukraine and the way that he's put together an international coalition to assist Ukraine. There's been major bipartisan domestic achievements, infrastructure bill, CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act. I could go on, but those have all been largely successful. Currently, I think a collection of historians have rated him as the 14th president of all time. But campaigning is different. And I think you would be fooling yourself if you thought that he could campaign effectively right now. And the way that, when I say effectively, campaigning the way he needs to, this is an election of a lifetime. This is a critical election. Can he do numerous, campaign stops in the same day? Can he give the vigorous speeches that citizens seem to want? And 86% of Americans have concerns about him running for a second term. I mean, you can't get 86% of Americans to agree on too many things. So I think it's a legitimate question, one that I think is a real problem for Democrats and Joe Biden. The second question, more pressure on Netanyahu is definitely needed. Putting conditions on aid on any, about 14% of all of Israel's defense budget comes from the United States. I think that's a huge number, but I also think, does it mean that Israel could act alone without United States aid? Democracy is not just important in the United States, it's important in Israel. The Israeli people I think Netanyahu is at his most popular when Israelis feel threatened. And I feel whether we agree with it, and I think we don't, Israeli people are supporting their government to take significant action to protect their people. And so what I'm trying to say is, despite what we do in the United States, and we are not super country, we are not the global policeman, we have huge power, but we don't have unlimited power to compel other sovereign states how to conduct their business. So I think sometimes we need a little bit be more humble in what we can actually do from the United States. But that being said, we condition foreign aid on all the time, and maybe that's something that the United States could do.
And to kind of jump off of that, in terms of Netanyahu, he's also facing his own legal woes once his premiership ends, right? And so it's kind of like one of those where he kind of holding onto the door like with both hands, and they're gonna have to peel one finger away at a time to kind of get him out of office, because once he is out of office, he's gonna be facing a lot of the same legal troubles that President Trump is currently facing as well.
He has his own, just real quick, he is at his strongest domestically when he's fighting a war.
Yeah.
What incentive does he have to end this war domestically?
Right.
And then internationally, again, if this war continues and is highly unpopular in the United States, and I'm not saying this is the motives, but could lead to Biden losing, Democrats losing, and Democrats losing the Senate in 2024, this is all beneficial for Netanyahu. I think there's a lot of external incentives and internal incentives to keep the war going.
And to go back to the Biden question, there's something I had wanted to say before that I just thought of now, and it's something that I think about a lot with him because, we're in an age when most of us, myself included, if I'm going to check in on somebody, I'm going to just send them a text message, right? He's part of that. He's very old school. And old school meaning he's going to pick up the phone and call you. So I think that part of it is that he like his messaging is not resonating as much because he literally comes from a different era. And it's not when you're dealing with it's a personal era. It's one-on-one when you're dealing with a person that is on an everyday basis, but it doesn't translate well when you're in a social media world. It's hard to make that same connection, I think, to a person. Whereas when you're dealing with them in the same room and you're sitting down, you're having a conversation, people say nothing but nice things about him. but it's much harder when you're kind of seeing only on social media or seeing things only, and of course videos that can be altered and that can be tampered with. We talked about artificial intelligence, which not just for Biden but for so many different things that are altered to appear one way or not the other. Or other questions?
All right. Well, thank you so much for attending, everybody, and thank you to Professor Lackney for bringing your class, and thank you for Troy Swanson and library staff for hosting us today. If you're interested, there's another event at 11 o'clock on the uniqueness of the 2024 election. Thank you.
Thank you.